Well, it's been fairly obvious, I think, for past books and my lectures on them, that I have no intention of covering everything in the book. My uh, my intention is to look at some of the issues in the book that jump out at me, dive into them a little bit more deeply, explore them using resources from other areas of theology and philosophy, and present those to you. You, of course, are still responsible for grasping the entire content of the book. That's going to be perhaps more true with our fourth and final book. I'm going to investigate, talk about, open up for us areas in the book that jumped out at me, that struck me as really interesting. And I'm aware that the areas that jump out at me might not jump out at you. And so once again, you are responsible for mastering the entire content of the book, as well as the areas that we investigate in these lectures. Now, before diving into some of the themes of the book, let's try to think a bit about some of the philosophical assumptions of science. That's right. Science rests on all sorts of philosophical assumptions. Things that science assumes are true, but are not provable by science itself. Now, that does not mean that such assumptions are not provable at all. Some things can be known independently of science. Think about how you know that rape is wrong, or that triangles have three sides, or that the interior angles of a Euclidean triangle sum to 180 degrees, or that you exist. You do not know any of those things by science. So, simply because something cannot be known via scientific investigation, it does not follow that it cannot be known at all. As we shall see, since science assumes a bunch of philosophical claims, and since we can be somewhat confident that science can get us to some truths, we can be confident that these philosophical assumptions are true, even though they are not provable by science. Here are some of those assumptions. Science has to assume that nature, the universe, is intelligible. Now, what does that mean? It means that the universe is graspable, understandable, that it is open to investigation, that we can make sense of it, or at least someone can make sense of it. So science has to assume that the universe is, for the most part, intelligible. Relatedly, but distinct, science assumes that the universe, nature, is intelligible to us. That we, beings like us, with minds like ours, beings that are finite and temporal and changeable, that we can grasp nature. To see the difference between that first assumption and this second assumption, just imagine the following. Imagine that nature and the universe is indeed intelligible, graspable, understandable, but in order to really understand it, you'd have to have a mind far greater than ours. So in this case, nature would be intelligible, but it wouldn't be intelligible to us. So science not only assumes that nature is intelligible, nature is graspable, understandable, but that it is understandable, intelligible to beings like us. Now, this may give rise to another philosophical assumption of science, that nature is, for the most part, uniform. The things happening in this part of the universe are similar to things happening in other parts of the universe. That the laws of nature that are operative over here are the same as the laws of nature that are operative over there. Now, this doesn't mean that science assumes that the universe is causally or naturally, physically deterministic. But it does mean that there are laws, there are regularities. And so this gives rise to a fourth assumption of science, that the observable patterns are signs of unobservable patterns. The observable patterns are signs of unobservable patterns. What that means is that what we can observe with our naked eyes, with our other senses, what we can observe maybe through various types of instruments, are signs of laws. Laws that govern those observable patterns. And so you might think that science is in the business of discovering these unobservable regularities, laws that either govern the behavior of the observable or are descriptions of the behaviors of the observables. Either way, the idea is the observable is fascinatingly interesting related to the unobservable, and that the unobservable may in fact be somewhat more basic. Science assumes this as it pursues laws of nature. Now, another assumption, and this one I'm maybe a little more tentative about, is that science assumes the existence of the material world. I think for the most part this is right. That is, science assumes that there is indeed an external world, a world outside of my mind, your mind, and that is the world, or at least that's part of what science is investigating. Science assumes logic, right? It assumes, for example, that inconsistent, incompatible theories cannot both be true. So take two theories, let's say T1 and T2. If the following is the case, if T1 is true, then T2 must be false. And if T2 is true, then T1 must be false. Then science says both cannot be true. Science assumes the rules of logic. Science also, I think, assumes something like the principle of sufficient reason, at least a weakened version of that principle. Here's the weak version I have in mind, that every event has a cause or an explanation of some sort. That's all. And so science assumes this. Just to give you a kind of quick example of this, science assumes that for all of the events that it is interested in investigating and understanding via its methods, its tools of investigation, science assumes that those events have some explanation of them. For example, science does not assume that planes can crash for no reason whatsoever. Don't confuse that with the following. I'm not saying that science assumes that it can discover every explanation. That's not what I'm saying. That is not an assumption of science. What I'm saying is that science assumes that there is an explanation, even if it turns out to be beyond the realm of scientific inquiry. If the principle of sufficient reason in this weakened form were false, then for every event that science investigates, it could be the case that there literally is no explanation whatsoever for it, and that science is really just barking up the wrong tree. This would make us incredibly skeptical of science. We would actually never be able to arrive at knowledge, because for every time science said, here's the explanation, we could always rationally assume that event had no explanation whatsoever, and science is mistaken. So science assumes something like a weakened version of what's called the principle of sufficient reason. Science also assumes normativity. Sometimes you'll be told that science is in the business of investigating facts. Science is value neutral. This is not the case. This is not the case at all, right? Science is interested in getting at the truth. It's not interested in getting at what is false. Already, that's a value that science has. It places more value on truth than falsity. And so it's after the truth. Science assumes that there are certain forms of reasoning and practice that are legitimate and truth conducive, and other forms that are not. For a dumb example, science assumes that shaking magic 8 balls in order to get answers to the questions we're interested in is not a truth-conducive form of investigation. The practice of science involves people, and those people need to have certain traits in order for science to do what it is supposed to do. They need to be honest, diligent, tenacious, not giving up at the first sign of difficulty, and so on. So those are just some of the philosophical assumptions of science. If you get rid of those assumptions, science makes no sense. Notice also that the following two are not assumptions of science. Keep these in mind. Empiricism is not an assumption of science. Empiricism, the type of empiricism that I have in mind is this. It is the claim that the only way to arrive at the truth is via sensory experience, observation, perception, that is the only way to get knowledge. Science does not assume empiricism. Science also does not assume that the natural forces are the only explanation of natural phenomena. That is, science doesn't assume what is sometimes called materialism or naturalism or physicalism. It does not assume that the natural forces are the only explanation of everything that occurs within the universe. Let's dive in. In chapter 1, what we have is an attempt to establish the independent nature of science, that it is a creature of God, directed by Him, for Him, to Him. And that science is to reveal to us the richness and fullness of God's thought and wisdom, of God's reason and logic that all of the creation rests upon and reflects. That's what science is aimed at, according to Abraham Kuyper. Now, Kuyper argues that science is a part of common grace, not special or saving grace. That's the grace that is given to all humans, regardless of their allegiance to God. That is, common grace is not the grace that results in salvation. It's common in the sense that it's universal, but it's not salvific. It doesn't save you from your sin, but nevertheless, it's gracious in the sense that it is a gift. It's not deserved. And so Kuyper wants to say that science is part of common grace, not saving grace. That's important because what that means is science is something available to all. It's a gracious gift of God to all persons at all times. Science belongs to the original creation. it would have existed, we would have done science, even if there had been no fall. Even if sin never entered into the world, science would still exist. Think of it like this. If there's no sin at all, there'd be no state, no government. We wouldn't need it, right? We wouldn't need a government to regulate the behavior of people, to distribute source resources, to punish criminals and protect the innocent. None of that would be needed if there were no sin. So no sin, no state, no government. No sin, no church. The church exists only because there is sin in the world. However, no sin, there'd still be science. There'd still be our need to investigate the universe, to uncover its hidden patterns. If there were no sin, there'd still be marriage. If there were no sin, there'd still be families. Neither marriage nor families owe their existence or validity to the government or the church. Think about that for a moment. That's important. And the same is with science. The independence of science rests on the fact that humans are made in God's image, and that means we're supposed to do something. We have a task to perform. God does not. Now we want to think about the relationship between science and God, and so God does not rely on the creation to think. This is actually really profound. God thinks independently of the creation, and the creation exists because of God's thinking. So the idea here is God didn't need the creation in order to be God, in order to think and reason and love or any of those things. We've encountered this before. The decrees of God, though, follow from the thinking of God, and creation is a decree of God. That's the idea here. So all of creation came into existence. All of creation it exists through divine reason and thinking. That's the idea. Creation depends on God's thinking. There's this great quote that Kuyper gives. He says, "Thus there can be nothing in the universe that fails to express, to incarnate the revelation of the thought of God." That's on page 39. All of this actually delivers or implies something really, really important. Science is an empirical discipline. By empirical, I mean it's a discipline that relies upon sensory observation, perception. Science is an empirical discipline that requires the use of our senses to discover various truths. Not all truths are like this. Some truths can be discovered independently of our senses. But since science is the investigation of the creation, and the creation could have failed to exist entirely, or could have existed differently than it does, the creation is contingent. We must look, listen, taste, smell, and feel to discover what the world is actually like. And so the empirical nature of science, why science rests upon sensory observation, is reflected in the contingency of the creation. That's fascinating. Since the creation could have been different, we can't know what the creation is by simply thinking hard. So science deals with a specific way of knowing. It deals with those things that are known via our senses. But as we shall see, in order for science to be more than simply recording observations, it has to go beyond mere sensory perception. Now, there's an important principle that we've encountered before, but I didn't call it to our attention explicitly. I'm going to do it now. The visible is a representation of the invisible. Think about it in the context of what we're talking about. The visible creation is a representation of the mind of God. The creation is made by and through thinking. It's upheld by thinking. The thinking of God is for a purpose according to a plan. And humans are able to reflect that. Since we're made in God's image, and that image originally included holiness, righteousness, wisdom, we're able to, in the words of Kuyper, reflect the thought that God had embodied in the creation when he created it. This is fascinating. And from all that, three truths, three implications to highlight. All of God's thoughts existed in God from eternity. Second, the creation embodies a rich fullness of God's thoughts. And third, God made humans with a capacity to understand, grasp, reflect, and arrange the thoughts of God embodied in the creation. Now think about all those things. What do those truths that we get by seeing how creation and God are related suggest? Those philosophical assumptions that I started off with today are true. And Christianity, Christian theism, makes sense of them beautifully. Science is the study of the Word of God. It is a study of the thoughts of God. It is images, us studying other images to understand more deeply what they are all images of. So here's my quasi-definition of science. Science is created persons studying the uncreated person's revelation of themselves in their magnificent works and creation. Or put more simply, science is creatures studying the thoughts of their creator.